We will hear argument this morning in case 2512.
The grievances we could go into with this system. I think we could be here for hours.
National Collegiate Athletic Association.
I think we have some proof, even a few years into NIL now, that people care about the logo.
There are too many people in power who have no desire to give up that power.
The NCAA's ever-shifting decisions, not stable decisions.
Does the concept of amateurism in college athletics even matter anymore?
They've capped it again without any sort of collective bargaining.
We'll finish with our unilateral decision.
Welcome back to another episode of Unilateral Decisions. We are excited to have our first guest ever on this show. I'm going to let Mike do the introduction. But one thing I do find comical is that the two podcasts, probably the only two podcasts in the world that have talked about Rick Neuheisel in the last 2 weeks, are coming together for today's episode.
We do have a lot in common. We love that. We're super excited. I have Alex Kirshner, the co-host, co-founder of Split Zone Duo, one of the country's premier college football podcasts. Alex has built a reputation for explaining everything from on-field results to conference realignment, media rights, NCAA governance, the economics of college sports, and the forces shaping where the industry is heading next. Before launching Split Zone Duo, Alex established himself as a national journalist whose work has appeared in publications including The Athletic, Slate, The Atlantic, The Ringer. The list goes on and on and on. He also brings a background covering politics and public policy, giving him a unique perspective on how legislation, litigation, and government continue to influence the future of college athletics. Alex, I think the congratulations are more in order for us than they are for you, but nonetheless, congrats on being the first guest on Unilateral Decisions.
Thank you. The check is in the mail for the intro. Part of why we have a good show at Split Zone Duo is that we have smart guests on, such as Sam Ehrlich, for example. So it's an honor to return the favor and be back here with you.
Yeah, absolutely. I was really honored and privileged to be on Split Zone Duo last week talking about the Protect College Sports Act, and happy to now have you return the favor and join us and kind of give us similar insight, kind of a little bit of a crossover episode, kind of like those situations where you have the two shows where you have one who joins one show and does that and then returns the favor. So
yes, I believe it's called a home and home.
That's true. Why am I putting this in the TV context?
Exactly.
We have a perfect
the
example.
Guarantees are much lower.
And we scheduled this on a lot shorter notice than most of these home and homes are scheduled.
Much shorter.
Sam, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, absolutely. So Alex, one thing that, of course, I think everyone in college sports has really been talking about over the past few weeks, there's been a lot to talk about, but of course, we have this, at this time still, a little newer bill, at least related to the SCORE Act, the Protect College Sports Act, that seems to be making at least some momentum. It went very quickly. It was able to pass through committee, last week, and really have the momentum that I think a lot of these other bills just haven't been able to have, and have the bipartisan support. So, Alex, from your perspective, what is your take on the bill, and what do you think kind of the issues with it, the good things about it? How do you see it as a compromise measure given its bipartisan nature?
I'm caught in between two things. I don't want to just sit here and say that it's this disgraceful effort, it's not serious, because I think it is serious. And if you want the United States Senate to return to some degree of workmanlike spirit and live up to its name as the quote-unquote world's greatest deliberative body, I think you have to accept that this is sort of what that looks like, even if it comes from Ted Cruz, who I think is sort of a red meat guy and not always necessarily the most details-focused legislator in the world. It's one of those situations where I think you have to tip your cap a little bit, because the process here has been serious. It's been exhausting. I mean, it's been 6-7 years of hearings of the NCAA and a lot of member schools asking for something like this. And they put together a bill that, along with Senator Cantwell from Washington, they put together a bill that I think is serious. Like it tries to solve problems for an industry that we all work in and care about in college sports. And I think that is a spirit that is honestly worth commending, in the interest of not being too irony poisoned and just saying everything is bad all the time. I still think the bill has a pretty fundamental existential problem, which is that it's trying to dictate the economic future, cap the economic future in a lot of ways of college athletes without giving them a seat at the table. And I do feel a bit crazy that we're just continuing to do this and go through this entire dog and pony show instead of just acknowledge reality and begin the process of making these players, at least in FBS football, employees.
I think before we jump too far into those details, 'cause I know where Joe's going with this, I want to kind of zoom out a little bit. You spend a lot of time covering Capitol Hill and college football. Can you help us kind of calibrate our expectations of, is college athletics actually a meaningful issue in Congress? Or are those of us who work in and around it kind of in an echo chamber and, maybe we're not, we're overestimating the amount of attention that lawmakers are giving it? How does that look in your mind?
I think yes to all of the above. It is a serious issue right now in Congress. We in college sports and around college sports probably overstate the priority level for this issue in Congress. I don't think, for example, that anyone in either party thinks the midterms are going to hinge on how this bill goes. Seems unlikely to me. I won't be voting based on the outcome of this legislation. I don't know anyone who will be voting based on whether this bill passes or in what form it passes. But there is only so much time on the calendar in the United States Senate, not to mention the House, before everyone sort of buzzes off to go campaign for the balance of the midterm elections, which are obviously already very much in full swing. And so it is a bit of an oddity to be looking at this and expecting some sort of landmark legislation to pass. By the time this episode comes out, it's probably going to be July. So let me count. August, September, October, November. That's 4 months. Not a lot of time. It's a high priority, but there are higher priorities right now. And there is a limited clock between now and the time that, that very little work gets done in Congress because everyone is off literally running their reelection campaigns up to Election Day.
Yeah, you kind of touched on it a little bit ago. There's this perception that the only way anything is going to get done to quote unquote save college athletics is an act of Congress. But there's also collective bargaining, and we saw reports, from SEC meetings that, SEC personnel were already preparing for collective bargaining in the off chance that they're not saved, by politicians. How much credence should we put into collective bargaining as a real possibility? Because that seems, I bang this drum all the time about collective bargaining. Like we're capping everything without having any conversations with the people that are being capped. And I don't know, I guess I'll just throw it your way from there.
Yeah. I think it's a serious idea. I think its time will come. I don't think it's coming in the interim. Certainly not while Donald Trump is the president. Certainly not while the NLRB is under the control of folks in his camp. I just don't expect that it's coming imminently. Not to mention what is for the moment, I don't think it will be for much longer, but a Republican Congress that could have some role to play as well in whether college sports goes down that road. There have been times in the last few years when I earnestly thought we would have at least if not multiple college sports unions by this date. We're recording this on June 30th, 2026. I think if you'd have asked me honestly 4 years ago, would there be a union in college sports by this exact date? I think I would have said yes. And maybe we would have even picked this exact date because the college sports sort of academic and fall sports year tends to start on July 1st. Maybe this is the date that I would have highlighted as the over-under. And then a lot of things changed. And I'm sure a lot of your listeners know what those things are. Number one, Joe Biden isn't the president anymore. The National Labor Relations Board is not composed the same way that it was, particularly not at the very important and highly influential general counsel role, where Biden's appointee for that job was sort of really a driving force behind some sort of federal push for athletes to have collective bargaining opportunities, specifically to be employees, which is obviously a necessary precondition of collective bargaining. And all those things are just different now. So I tend to think it will come around because I think it is such common sense and it is so much simpler than everything else that college sports is trying to do at the moment. But, you all can be the judge of whether the Republican Party is going to be the catalyst for something that would be an unambiguous win for organized labor. And I think we are all adults enough to know that they are probably not going to do that.
And so in the meantime, you mentioned how unlikely that is to happen in the current setup. But, you know, in your first answer, you kind of talked through some of the things that we could work toward. If the federal legislation is not, the current bill that's on the table is not going to happen, then over the next couple of years with the current administration and everything, what small steps can be taken to get closer to the point that this stability is a reality for college sports?
I think implementing the House settlement the way that the conferences, particularly the autonomy conferences, sort of handshook and agreed it would be implemented about a year ago, right? Yeah, about a year ago, would be a start. You know, I don't think it's tenable for insert school or insert conference to try to blow up the foundations of the House settlement every time they get a ruling they don't like out of the clearinghouse or the college sports commission above it. It just doesn't seem, it does not seem like it lends itself to stability when that happens. And so far, I actually think the system has sort of held, like not perfectly. Collectives have certainly taken their pound of flesh from this process already. And I know that there are a lot of people in college sports who thought that the threshold for what would count as a valid business purpose and like what would be a legitimate quote unquote NIL deal would be higher than it has turned out to be in reality. There's still a lot of deals that sure don't look like they're being struck for advertising reasons. But at the same time, I mean, just ask Nebraska, which, tried to get some deals through by way of working with its multimedia rights partner and didn't. And so I think it's working a bit. I think that, to some extent, the system is going the way that it was supposed to go, but with, some reasonably heavy limitations. And I think that in the interim, if this bill doesn't pass, the closest thing that college sports will get to stability is if people just kind of agree to be bound by the thing that they agreed to be bound by and the spirit of it, which I think is the missing ingredient sometimes.
Well, another potential solution that's been talked about and kind of one that's almost kind of emerges, almost a third option to collective bargaining, and something we talked about on the show a few weeks ago, is the potential single conference governance, where the SEC or the Big Ten kind of come together individually and say, we're going to make the rules for ourselves. We're going to have eligibility rules for ourselves. We're going to have compensation rules for ourselves, and do it in a way that tries to insulate themselves from antitrust law because they're competing with each other as conferences and not necessarily dominating the entire market. Do you think that's a practical, practically speaking, or even legally speaking, to your extent, to your knowledge, a potential solution here?
I could speak to practically speaking. You could certainly speak better than I could to the legal efficacy of it, but practically speaking, that's how college sports used to work in a lot of ways. I mean, I think the last time that this really came up in a way that generated a lot of national attention might have been around the time that the Big 12 was being formed, and you had this conflict between the Big 8 schools, most significantly Nebraska under Tom Osborne at the time, and the Southwest Conference schools that were coming together to form this league about what would constitute a qualifier. Like what kind of academic resume would you be able to get onto your roster if you wanted to? And Nebraska and the Big 8 favored a more permissive environment than the Big 12 did, and it became this, or than the Southwestern Conference did, and then the new Big 12 would turn out to, and it became this pretty public conflict between Nebraska and its new league, and the new league won, and it's one of the reasons why Nebraska, among others, has had the last couple decades that it's had in football. Over the years since then, a lot of the eligibility criteria in college sports have been homogenized at the national level because that makes the most sense. Because number one, they're just agreed upon best practices that are no longer as controversial as they were before. But number two, because people in college sports don't like patchworks. They don't like quilts of regulations because someone will always race to the bottom, much like America, by the way, much like any regulatory environment elsewhere in this country. And, someone will use that to get ahead, whoever wins the race to the bottom. I think that's the obvious problem with it. But if there's enough desperation, if there's enough instability elsewhere, then, I don't think that Greg Sankey is making it up when he and SEC presidents talk about perhaps pursuing something like this. They might be bluffing, but I don't know that it's made up out of whole cloth and that there's no chance they would do it. I'm not even sure if they know if they're bluffing or not.
So to a certain extent, this is kind of, crossing paths a little bit, because obviously if the PCSA passes, it kind of potentially changes the conversation on single conference governance. But one really interesting provision in the Protect College Sports Act that has generated a lot of discussion, including here in Boise, has been the provision that would essentially freeze together all these conferences, the Power Four conferences, and essentially tell not just the Big Ten and the SEC anymore, but now after amendment, the ACC and the Big 12, any conference that has over $700 million in revenue, that they cannot add any other teams, including, according to reporting by Ross Dellinger, and based on his conversations with people on Capitol Hill, including taking in G6 schools. What's your take on that provision? Do you think that's something that's going to be part of the bill moving forward, or do you think it's going to be something that's going to be changed?
I think it's cool. I like it. There's a lawyer on my shoulder telling me you can't do that. I don't know. It does seems pretty aggressive. I'm not sure if you can do that, but there are a number of elements of this bill that are very populist, and some of those I don't think are entirely geared towards actually solving problems. Like, for instance, the quote-unquote Lane Kiffin rule, the idea that Congress is going to be able to stop agents from maneuvering midseason to get coaches into new jobs sounds like the kind of thing that is for the fans, but I think we can all imagine a lot of ways that would just get worked around. The idea of basically freezing power conference membership to prevent further consolidation, to me, seems great as a fan of the sport. I hope they can do it. I think it would be wonderful. I'm assuming that I'll believe when I see it. I'm just assuming there are going to be some challenges with actually getting that together. And I wish everyone the best of luck if this bill becomes law.
What are the pieces of the bill that you gravitate toward, that you think we should find a way to bring those to, fruition?
Yeah. I think this is an interesting start with the conference membership. I think the main thing that I like about the bill is that it's the first time that any serious body, any organization with clout, the United States Congress no less, would put something forward that is designed to promote the stability of college sports and does not interpret 100% of that to mean capping players' economic liberties. It's still doing that, don't get me wrong. I don't want to give it too much credit. But I've been kind of screaming for years that you've got to do something about realignment. You've got to do something about coach pay. And I don't really think that this addresses coach pay. I think it sort of gestures in the direction of getting coaches a little bit under control, at least in their negotiating power during a season. But I appreciate that it doesn't completely ignore what, to me, are two much more obvious and more difficult to defend issues of instability in college sports, which are realignment, the telling of dozens of fan bases and schools that they just don't matter, and the ridiculous state of coach pay, which, if you say it's a free market, that's fine. But the treatment of coaches as a free market and not players just doesn't work for me. And I appreciate that this bill at least sort of acknowledges, gestures in the direction that might be a problem. Don't want to overpraise it because it doesn't seem to fix it, but it at least acknowledges that world that we live in. I think some of the provisions in the bill about a medical fund, about the economic responsibilities that schools have to players who get hurt during play are compelling. I think that if we look at, this is such a huge bill, and I don't have the text in front of me, though I should have right now, but I would say this as well. I like the 5-and-5 eligibility thing that this bill puts forward. I'm very sick of seventh-year college football players. That's not what this was supposed to be. I really feel like part of the magic of college football is that you only get 4 shots, maybe 5, at beating your rival, at having the season that you want, that it doesn't last forever, that there's a certain vanishing nature of every opportunity you get. And when we just keep tacking on eligibility, and I understand there's good lawyers working on this. I saw the Tristan Smith case, the wide receiver at Clemson, just about a week or so before we recorded this. I'm not saying that these athletes don't have a legal leg to stand on, because that's up to the lawyers and the judges. But practically, like as someone who enjoys the sport, who has been a fan of the sport my entire life, I don't care for it. I don't root for it to continue. And I think a 5-5 with, very narrow exceptions is the way to go. I'm not a huge fan of the transfer limitation that you get one free one and then you have to sit out. But I think I'm probably less violently opposed to that than I would have been a few years ago, because I actually don't think the state of the portal is great for players. Not to sound like too much of a Pollyanna, but I think it's probably bad when players transfer 3 or 4 times. Doesn't seem very conducive to having a good college experience. It's a little nanny statey, I think, to be requiring, a different standard for athletes transferring than it is for other students transferring or coaches. But I think I'm more interested in that than I would have been like 3 or 4 years ago. So that's kind of an overview of what I like and what I'm okay with in that bill.
One of the other things the bill provides a pathway for is an amendment of the Sports Broadcasting Act, so that conferences could pool their media rights together, which I think there's an argument as to whether or not that would, make more money available or less. Some people believe that it would. But in order to do that, 75% would have to agree, and then that would trigger protections for Olympic sports and women's sports. Do we think there's a realistic chance that 75% of these schools would agree to pool their media rights together?
This is the ultimate conflict in the bill, and the one that I think is likeliest to sink it, because the SEC and the Big Ten have seats at the table, and athletes don't really. If I was Greg Sankey or Tony Petitti, I'd probably be doing what they're doing, which is telling their school presidents to sort of put the screws to members of Congress and to United States senators. I noticed the other week, Steve Scalise, who is the House Majority Whip, I believe, Majority Leader, Majority Whip, I don't want to mistitle him. He's had a couple of jobs over the years. But Steve Scalise, very high up in House Republican leadership, comes out against this bill and against the Senate version of this bill getting through the House of Representatives. And, I wonder what happened there, right? Like, could it have anything to do with LSU perhaps telling the most powerful Louisiana Republican in Congress that they don't think this is very good for Louisiana State University because the SEC has interpreted that it's bad for the SEC? That same thing is going to happen at 18 Big Ten schools and 15 other SEC schools. It probably already is happening, and if it's not, it's really going to happen in an escalating fashion over the next few months. I do not think, for one thing, and I realize I'm not directly answering the question, I don't think for one thing that this bill is going to pass over these loud objections from the Big Ten and the SEC. But I guess to answer the question directly, if this bill did pass, then yeah, I think it was designed so that you could get basically everyone but them together, and you might be able to achieve that. I don't know if we're going to get to that point where it matters, because these universities and the presidents, the athletic directors of these schools, despite all of the sort of pinata making that the Republicans have done over higher education in the last few years, they're still, like, every individual school is still very influential with senators, congressmen from that state, right? Like, you don't want to be seen going against big state U. And so, it might be appealing to think, they're going to stick it to higher education because they have disagreements over academic curricula or trans policies or what have you. But at the end of the day, are you really going to go against the tide if you're Katie Britt or Tommy Tuberville? I mean, maybe Tommy Tuberville, given his coaching history, maybe that's a bad example. But are you really going to go against one of the biggest brands, maybe the biggest brand in your state, to get this bill through when they tell you, because the SEC and Big Ten told them that they don't think it's a good idea? I'll believe that when I see it as well.
So a follow-up question on that. How much of the opposition by the Big Ten and the SEC do you think is actually legitimate, or do you think they're really trying to position the negotiation to say, we are going to go against the bill if you don't make these changes. But even if you don't make these changes behind the scenes, we're still going to vote for it because we think the pros outweigh the cons.
That's a great question, and I don't know the answer for sure. I assume that the Big Ten and the SEC will try to make themselves look like winners if they think this bill is going to pass. Like they will extract something that allows them to say that they were for it all along, and this is a win for them. But I really think that they'd have to sort of be dragged kicking and screaming to accept a bill. Not that it's up to them whether they accept it or not, but to live in a world where this bill passes and ropes them into a broader media rights consolidation. It sort of takes away Tony Petitti and Greg Sankey's reason for existing, especially Tony Petitti's at the Big Ten. I mean, this guy got this job because he's a media guy. It's what he's supposed to do. And it's Greg Sankey, I think, has sort of a slightly broader raison d'etre, if you will, for being the SEC commissioner. I think things are, as they say, just a little bit different in the SEC. But his biggest job, too, is media rights. It's not even close. It's the number one thing that he's in his job for. And I don't think these conference offices are going to be very excited if this consolidation agenda comes to pass.
Well, I appreciate you coming on, Alex. This is, getting our first guest on the show it's cool. And because it's you, it kind of feels like we made it. So appreciate you.
That's extremely kind. It's wonderful to be with you guys. I've enjoyed the talk.
Well, thank you so much for your time, and we look forward to speaking to you again in the future.
Thank you, Alex.
Thanks, guys. Best of luck with everything. We'll see you again.
Oh, thank you. All right. Well, that was awesome having a guest on. We should do that more frequently, especially guys like Alex. He's great. But in the spirit of how we normally end the show, and in the future, we'll be better about this and maybe include the guest in the unilateral decision. But Sam, you mentioned something about amending the bill and, what kind of conversations are going to be had to, see if this ever gets the opportunity to get pushed through. So I'm interested, unilateral decision, a couple caveats. One, what's one thing that you would do as far as amending the bill, but so that it is more likely to pass? Not what would you amend, Mike? What would you amend so that it is more likely to pass?
Yeah, and those are two very different questions. So, though it's kind of funny because I actually think my answer to both would be the same, though for very different reasons. I think the provision that freezes conference membership is probably one where I think there's a lot of opposition to it on both sides of, I won't even say the aisle because it's, clearly not a bipartisan issue, but both sides of kind of the conversation, because for one, it makes the Power Four feel like they're being targeted. It's certainly not the only thing in the bill that makes them feel like they're being targeted, but one of the things that I think they're, clearly the most vocal about is, hey, we're being targeted for the potential of doing a super league, and we don't even know if we want to do a super league, and maybe we're talking behind the scenes about doing a super league, but it's not something we're necessarily tied to doing. But on the other hand, there's also a lot of opposition from G6 conferences and G6 schools. I saw an interview with Colorado State's president a couple days ago where he really kind of expressed a lot of opposition to this, a lot of doubt about this, just saying, hey, this affects our upward mobility. This affects the fact that, we feel like we are a Big 12 school, and we are continuing to have conversations with the Big 12. And I think a lot of schools in the Pac-12, for example, feel similarly about this and kind of have the position where it's like, yeah, we set up the Pac-12 specifically to only have a 5-year cycle because we want to position ourselves to be able to move up into bigger conferences and get those bigger paychecks and do all these different things. And so I think there's going to be a lot of opposition for the bill on both sides of it, including by, I imagine, a lot of people who have previously supported the bill, and a lot of G6 schools who are like, hey, it's great that we're having these salary cap, these compensation provisions. But if you're making it actually harder for us to move up, if making it impossible for us to move up without filing a lawsuit and maybe winning that lawsuit to try to get this bill, part of the bill, be deemed unconstitutional, we're going to actually be against this bill, or we're going to fight back against this. And I think a way to kind of grease the scales, or grease the treads, I should say, not to mix metaphors, is to, remove that part of the bill or change it in a way where it doesn't necessarily both target the power two, but also doesn't affect the upward mobility that is so inherent to college athletics, as much as people, like Alex was saying, as much as people just don't like realignment.
I agree. I do have a different answer. I think I think your answer probably is, I'm going to say, the right answer. I do think there's another angle. I think, a lot of what Alex talked about, and we've talked about previously on the show, the way we kind of put it was that this sort of makes collective bargaining a little less interesting, right? Because some of the provisions are already just in the bill and they're set in stone and you can't do anything about it. And so I've been trying to think through, even as you asked the question, does it make it more likely to pass if you were to go back and even just kind of reduce some of those provisions that are in there and not put them in stone anymore? And I'm not sure that it does, but I think there's probably a way you can make some amendments to it to, still allow the athletes, should they become formally labor, to have a bunch of rights that they could still bargain and negotiate. And I think that we talked about it a couple weeks ago when this first really came out, and really the commentary was like, no one really gets what they want here. And I think that you've got to find enough of something that a large group of people wants. Is that the right thing? Is the labor piece and backing the athletes, is that going to get you enough more votes to get this across the finish line? That's unclear. I think just at this point, a lot of what Alex talked about, a lot of what you talked about, is it posturing from the big conferences, or can you assume that their senators are not going to vote for this regardless? Because I don't know that this provision changes a whole lot of the Big Ten and the SEC's position if you were to make the amendment that I'm bringing forward here. But in the event that it changes just enough of it, because I do think that you can bring one side of the aisle closer to voting on this and voting in favor of this, if you can eliminate some of the things that continue to restrict labor. And so that's the amendment that I would make. I think we were all, I'll speak for myself. When it came out, I was glad that it didn't, it was fairly silent on employment. It didn't provide that they will never become employees, right? But I think you have to take it a step further, as we talked about before, that if this bill goes into law as written and then athletes become employees, how much can they still collectively bargain, because there's already federal law around it? And I think that you have to strip some of those away. So that's what I would do, is I would amend it to strip away some of those things to still allow collective bargaining to have a place in this space a couple of years from now when, maybe that opportunity comes to fruition. And I think that might bring you closer to a positive vote.
Yeah, I'm probably going to piggyback on that. One of the things Alex talked about was, if this goes through, you're going to see, Big Ten and SEC schools saying, they were supportive of it the whole time because they're going to be looking, to get some sort of a win out of this. So piggybacking off what you said, my mind initially went to how can we put more control, back with the conferences, and just you were going collective bargaining. And for me, maybe that's allowing the conferences to set, their cap. Instead of the cap being the same across the board, let that cap be conference specific, providing an opportunity to negotiate that with that conference's athletes. And that probably starts with football and then, men's basketball as well. But, there's got to be a way to provide something in that iteration to the conferences so that they feel like they're getting a win. If the Big Ten and SEC have the ability to spend more, than, one of the G6 conferences, then so be it. But I also think one of the things that was, you saw the commercials all season for the SCORE Act, touting, protecting women's sports and Olympic sports and all that. Like, some of these protections, in my understanding right now, is that those only get triggered if 75% of the schools decide to pool their media rights. And
most of them, yeah.
So there's got to be a way to protect that regardless of anything getting triggered. Like, no, you are protecting Olympic sports and women's sports in this bill, period.
Actually, I just remembered they actually did take that out of the Sports Broadcasting Act provision. So that based on a recent amendment, they actually did make that part of the whole bill even if the Sports Broadcasting Act part is
you already did it.
So you already did it. Congratulations.
Half of what I'm talking about has already come to fruition. So, but yeah, going back to what I was talking about, giving some more power to the conferences. Maybe that makes sense for a lot of these schools to be more supportive of it. And as Alex touched on, presidents and schools talking to their, statewide representatives, maybe that helps things get through a little easier. I don't know. I'm not in politics and I have no idea. So
we're already thinking like one. Your amendment has already been amended.
You guys are all welcome. All right. Well, that'll do it for this week's episode of Unilateral Decisions. Thanks again to Alex. Awesome to have him on. Really smart guy. Great stuff from those guys. So we'll see you next week.